My wife mocked me, saying I was worse in bed than her ex. I said, "We're getting a divorce." Can you believe it? I caught my wife red-handed, and the truth shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. What would you do if the one you trusted most betrayed you in the worst possible way? You won't believe how this story unfolds, and the ending will leave you speechless. Don't miss a second, keep watching to see how it all falls apart, and how I turn it around. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the faint tick-tock of the clock on the wall. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air, but the plate sat half empty on the table. The candles I'd lit earlier flickered faintly, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. I sat there, staring at my plate, the uneaten food cold and unappetizing. Across from me, my wife, Lily, barely looked up. She was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Her silence felt heavier than any words she could have said. For the past few weeks, no, months, I'd been trying to reach her, trying to understand what had changed. At first, I told myself it was just stress, just the pressure of work, of life. But tonight, sitting in that dimly lit room, it was impossible to ignore the truth. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked, my voice steady, though my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. She didn't answer at first, just kept scrolling. I waited, letting the silence hang there, hoping she would look up, say something, anything. After a moment, she sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound that sent a chill down my spine. "It's fine," she said without looking at me, her tone flat and disinterested. Fine. That one word carried so much weight, so much finality. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. I pushed my plate away, leaning back in my chair. I felt the wood creak beneath me as I ran a hand through my hair. "Lily," I said. Softer this time, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "What's going on? You've been distant. We haven't really talked in weeks. You barely look at me anymore." She finally put down her phone and glanced up at me, but the look in her eyes wasn't what I expected. There was no anger, no annoyance, just indifference. It was as if I was a stranger sitting at her table, not the man she had once said she loved. "I'm tired, James," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've just got a lot on my mind." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no attempt to bridge the widening gap between us. She went back to her phone, her thumb scrolling absently as if our conversation had never happened. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, a heavy, suffocating feeling that made it hard to breathe. I stared at her for a moment longer, trying to find the right words, the right way to get through to her. But what was the point? I had tried before again and again. I had brought her flowers, planned weekends away, cooked her favorite meals. Each time, she would smile, say thank you, and then retreat back into herself. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But it wasn't passing. It was getting worse. I looked down at my hands, noticing how tightly I was gripping the edge of the table. My knuckles were white, the veins in my arms standing out like cords. "I can't keep doing this," I muttered under my breath, not loud enough for her to hear. The words felt strange, like they didn't belong to me, but once they were out, I couldn't take them back. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that we could go back to how we used to be. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a rough patch. It was something much deeper, something broken that I couldn't fix on my own. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want it to be fixed. I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, and rested my head in my hands. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, closing in around me. I thought about all the nights we had spent sitting at this same table, laughing, talking, planning our future. I thought about how I used to look at her and see the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Now, I didn't even recognize her. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and distant. I felt like a ghost in my own home, invisible, unheard, unwanted. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She picked it up and smiled, a small, fleeting smile that wasn't meant for me. My stomach churned. I looked away, staring out the window at the darkened street outside. The streetlights cast a faint glow on the pavement, and the occasional car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the room. I wanted to say something, to ask her who she was texting, what was so important that it could bring a smile to her face when I couldn't even get her to look at me. But I stayed silent. I didn't want to know the answer. Not tonight. Not yet. Instead, I stood up and cleared the plates from the table, carrying them into the kitchen. The sound of running water filled the air as I rinsed the dishes, the warm water stinging my hands. It was something to do, something to keep me from spiraling any further. I scrubbed each plate with more force than necessary, my mind racing. What had gone so wrong? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? I thought back to the early days of our relationship, to the way we used to stay up all night talking, laughing, dreaming about the life we would build together. Where had that gone? When had it disappeared? I turned off the water and set the plates on the drying rack. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened kitchen window, tired eyes, furrowed brow, a man who barely recognized himself. I gripped the edge of the counter, my shoulders heaving as I took deep, steadying breaths. Get it together, I whispered to myself. You can figure this out. You can fix this. But the words felt hollow, empty. I wasn't sure if I believed them anymore. When I finally returned to the dining room, Lily was gone. The chair she had been sitting in was empty, pushed back just slightly. Her phone was gone too. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty chair, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the table. It felt symbolic, in a way. The room, once filled with warmth and light, now felt cold and empty. I turned off the candles, leaving the room in darkness, and made my way upstairs. In the bedroom, Lily was already in bed, her back turned to me. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say, unsure if I should say anything at all. I wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, to ask her one more time what was wrong, but something held me back. I was afraid of the answer. I was afraid of what it would mean if she told me the truth, that she didn't love me anymore, that she never really did. So I stayed silent. I climbed into bed beside her, the distance between us feeling wider than ever. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions that I didn't have the courage to ask. In the darkness, the weight of it all pressed down on me. The memories, the doubts, the unanswered questions, they all swirled together, filling the silence with a deafening roar. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was drowning, caught in a current I couldn't escape. And in that moment, I realized that I was holding on to something that was already gone. The woman I loved was gone. The life we had built was crumbling. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I wasn't sure if I could keep holding on. I tried to convince myself that maybe tonight had just been another bad day, another rough patch that would smooth out if I gave it enough time. But that excuse was beginning to wear thin. This wasn't just a tough season we were going through. It was something much bigger, much darker. I could feel it in the silence that followed us everywhere now, in the way Lily didn't look at me, didn't touch me, didn't seem to care whether I was there or not. I could feel it in the way she spoke, short and clipped, as if she was forcing herself to interact with me out of obligation rather than desire. But what hurt most of all was the way she smiled at her phone, something I hadn't seen her do for me in what felt like forever. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. I couldn't keep pretending this was normal. The house felt too quiet again. I stood in the living room, staring at the darkened television screen, its surface reflecting the dim light from the lamp in the corner. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window pane, and the occasional car passed by, tires hissing on the wet pavement. It was a scene so ordinary, yet everything about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as I worked up the courage to speak. "Lily," I called out, my voice steady, though my chest tightened with each syllable. No response. I heard her footsteps upstairs, the faint creak of the floorboards as she moved around. I wasn't sure if she'd heard me or if she was deliberately ignoring me. Either way, I had to try again. "Lily," I said, louder this time. "Can we talk for a minute?" There was a pause, a long silence that made my heart pound in my chest. Finally, I heard her descending the stairs, her movement slow and deliberate. When she stepped into the living room, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her eyes were tired, her mouth set in a thin line. She leaned against the doorway, crossing her arms, as if bracing herself for whatever I was about to say. "What is it, James?" she asked, her tone neutral, almost detached. I gestured toward the couch. Can you sit down, please? She hesitated, then walked over and sat on the edge of the couch, her posture stiff and defensive. I stayed standing, unsure how to start. I rubbed the back of my neck, my mouth suddenly dry. This was the moment I'd been dreading, but I couldn't put it off any longer. I feel like we've been off lately, I began, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my stomach churned. You've been distant. You barely talk to me. You spend all your time on your phone or upstairs. I'm trying to understand what's going on, but I can't if you don't tell me. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something: regret, guilt, maybe even sadness. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She looked away, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. I don't know what you want me to say, she replied quietly. Just be honest with me, I said, my voice firmer now. If something's wrong, if you're unhappy, I need to know. We can't keep going on like this. I need to understand what's happening so we can figure out how to fix it. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers picking at a loose thread on the couch cushion. It's not that simple, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. Why not? Why can't we just talk about it? Lily looked up at me then, her expression cold, distant. Because, James, she said, her words sharp enough to cut. Sometimes things just don't work out, and you can't force them to. Her statement hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on me. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse quicken. What are you saying? I asked, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. She sighed, rubbing her temples as if this conversation was more of a nuisance than a serious discussion about our marriage. I'm saying that maybe we shouldn't keep pretending everything is fine. Maybe we need to face the fact that we're not happy anymore. Not happy anymore. The words echoed in my head, each syllable hitting me like a blow. I had known things weren't perfect. I wasn't blind. But hearing her say it out loud, so matter-of-factly, felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. So that's it? I asked, my voice rising. You're just ready to give up? After everything we've been through? She looked at me then, her eyes narrowing, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. I'm not giving up, she said, her voice tense. I'm just being realistic. Sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes they realize they made the wrong choice. I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. The wrong choice? I repeated. You're saying marrying me was a mistake? She hesitated, but then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded. I settled. James, she said, her voice flat, detached. I thought I could be happy with safe and reliable. But it's not enough. Her words hit me like a freight train. I felt the breath leave my lungs, my hands clenching at my sides. I tried to process what she'd just said, tried to make sense of it, but all I could feel was anger and hurt. So that's how you see me? I asked, my voice shaking. Safe? Reliable? Not enough? She didn't answer. She just sat there, her eyes locked on the floor. I took a step back, running a hand through my hair. My mind raced, a storm of emotions I couldn't control. How long had she felt this way? How long had she been looking at me as a consolation prize? I thought about all the moments I'd tried to show her how much I loved her, how much I cared, and all the while, she had been thinking of someone else, comparing me to someone else, wishing she was somewhere else. I felt my jaw tighten, my fists clench. I had wanted answers, but these weren't the answers I had expected. I had hoped for something fixable, something we could work through together. But this felt like a betrayal. It felt like she had been lying to me, not just in words, but in every moment we'd shared. Every smile, every laugh, every promise, it all felt like a lie. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I demanded, my voice rising. Why did you wait until now to say this? She looked up at me then, her expression unreadable. Because I thought it would get better, she said, her voice barely audible. I thought I could learn to be happy, but I can't. Her honesty, as brutal as it was, left me reeling. I stood there, staring at her, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to react. I felt like the world had just tilted on its axis, leaving me struggling to find my footing. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. This wasn't the life I thought we had. I had been holding on so tightly, trying so hard to keep us together, But it was clear now that I was the only one trying. The only one who still cared. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I turned away, my eyes burning, my throat tight. I couldn't look at her anymore. I couldn't stand to see the indifference in her eyes, the coldness in her voice. I walked over to the window, staring out at the rain as it streaked down the glass. I had wanted to talk, to fix things, to understand what was wrong. But now that I knew, I wasn't sure what to do next. How do you fix something that's already gone? How do you fight for someone who's already given up? The answer was painfully clear: you don't. You can't. And that realization was the most devastating of all. So what do you think happens next? Will one finally confront her head on? Or will the shocking secret I uncover make everything even worse? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I'll stand my ground, or a 2 if you think I'll walk away. I can't wait to hear your predictions. I stared out the window of my car, the raindrops trailing down the glass in long, uneven streaks. The windshield wipers swiped back and forth, steady and rhythmic, but I barely noticed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as I tried to focus on the road ahead. I was supposed to be heading into town to pick up groceries, but my mind was too preoccupied to think about the mundane task at hand. The events of last night replayed over and over in my head, like a broken record. Every word Lily said, every look she gave me, every silent moment that passed between us, all of it was burned into my memory, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. Her confession, her cold detachment, the way she admitted she'd settled for me like I was some kind of second-place trophy. It felt like a dagger in my chest, twisting deeper with every mile I drove. The roads were slick, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement in a kaleidoscope of red and gold. I passed familiar landmarks, the diner where we used to have breakfast on lazy Sunday mornings, the park where we'd once spent an afternoon laughing, chasing each other, and lying on the grass staring at the sky. It all felt so far away now, like it belonged to a different life, a different version of us. I wondered if she even remembered those moments, or if they just faded away for her, like a dream she barely recalled upon waking. For me, though, they were still vivid. I could remember the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, the warmth of her hand in mine. Those memories haunted me now, a cruel reminder of what we once had, and what we'd somehow lost along the way. I slowed to a stop at a red light, the faint hum of the engine the only sound in the car. Rain continued to drum against the roof, a steady, insistent rhythm that matched the heaviness in my chest. I glanced over at the passenger seat where her jacket had once been, where she used to sit, laughing and singing along to the radio. Now it was empty, and the silence was deafening. I hadn't even realized I was clenching my jaw until the light turned green, and I let out a slow, shaky breath. I eased my foot off the brake and continued down the road, though I had no real destination in mind anymore. I couldn't go home, not yet. Not when the air was still thick with the tension of our last conversation. I needed space, even if that space was just the inside of my car and the open road. I kept driving, my mind drifting back to the early days of our relationship. Back then, everything felt easy, effortless. We couldn't get enough of each other, spending every free moment together, talking about everything and nothing. I remembered how she used to run her fingers through my hair, laughing as she teased me about needing a haircut. I remembered the way she used to look at me, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. Where did that go? When did it start to slip away? I'd been asking myself that question for months now, maybe even longer. I'd tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of life, of work, of bills and responsibilities. But now I wasn't so sure. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. Something neither of us wanted to admit until it was too late. The rain started to let up as I turned onto a quieter street, the wipers squeaking faintly as they dragged across the windshield. I passed a row of small, charming houses, each one glowing warmly in the damp evening. Curtains were drawn back in some of the windows, revealing families gathered around dining tables, couples watching TV, children playing with toys on the living room floor. For a moment, I felt a pang of envy. How did it come so easily to them? What did they have that I didn't? I shook my head, gripping the wheel tighter. It was no use comparing myself to strangers whose lives I knew nothing about. But that thought didn't stop the ache in my chest from growing. It didn't stop me from wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd missed some crucial step along the way that could have kept us from falling apart. I finally pulled into a small parking lot near the edge of town, turning off the engine and letting the car settle into silence. I sat there for a while, watching the rainwater drip from the branches of a nearby tree. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, a face I barely recognized anymore. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, my expression heavier. I thought about all the times I'd tried to make her happy surprise dates, thoughtful gifts, long conversations late into the night. I thought about the times I'd put her needs above my own, convincing myself that it was worth it, that love meant sacrifice, that if I just gave enough of myself, everything would be okay. But now I wondered if I'd been wrong. I wondered if I'd been giving to someone who never truly wanted it, someone who never truly saw me the way I saw her. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the confines of the car. It was ironic, really. I'd spent so much time trying to hold on, trying to keep us together, and all the while she'd been drifting further and further away. I hadn't wanted to see it. I hadn't wanted to admit that maybe I wasn't enough for her, that maybe she'd never really loved me the way I loved her. The thought stung, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. Maybe it wasn't just her fault. Maybe I'd been blind to the signs, too stubborn or too afraid to acknowledge them. Maybe I'd been so desperate to keep the dream alive that I hadn't noticed when it started to crumble. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the raindrops clinging to the windshield. The sky was dark now, the streetlights casting a soft, golden glow on the wet pavement. The hum of a distant car engine drifted through the air, mingling with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to sit with the weight of it all, to feel the loss, the anger, the sadness, and the questions that would never have easy answers. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I couldn't keep chasing after something that no longer existed. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. Eventually, I started the car again and pulled out of the lot. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shiny in the dim light. I drove aimlessly for a while, the sound of the engine a quiet comfort as I tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't have a plan yet, didn't know what my next steps would be. But as I drove through the empty streets, something began to shift inside me. The ache was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. The anger still simmered, but it wasn't boiling over. I wasn't sure if I was ready to move on, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. And that realization, small and fragile as it was, felt like a start. After a while, I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner just off the main road. The glowing neon sign buzzed faintly above the entrance, casting a pale green hue over the wet asphalt. I'd been coming here on and off for years, mostly when I needed a break from the house, from the noise or the silence that had started to feel like a permanent fixture of my evenings. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the warmth of the car's heater fading as the outside chill seeped in. Through the fogged windshield, I could see a handful of customers scattered inside. The faint clatter of dishes and muffled conversations barely audible over the rain tapping on the roof. This was as good a place as any to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled like damp asphalt and coffee grounds, the rain having eased to a light drizzle. I shoved my hands into my pockets and pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The warmth and smell of fresh coffee hit me immediately, and I let out a slow breath as I stepped inside. The waitress behind the counter gave me a polite nod as I made my way to a booth near the back, away from the few other patrons. The vinyl seat squeaked as I sat down, the laminated menu sticking slightly to my hand as I picked it up. I wasn't hungry, not really, but I figured I'd order something just to have a reason to sit here a while. I glanced around the room, taking in the familiar details. The chrome accents on the counter stools, the old jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years, the worn linoleum floor with its faint checkerboard pattern. It was all comforting in a way, like stepping into a memory. I could almost hear Lily's laughter from one of the times we'd come here years ago, back when we were still happy, or at least when I thought we were. I remembered how we'd shared a plate of fries, her stealing the best ones while I pretended not to notice. I remembered the way she used to tease me about the way I drank my coffee, saying I liked my cream with a little coffee in it. For a moment, I let myself linger in that memory, holding onto the warmth of it, the illusion that it had been perfect. But then reality crept back in, like a shadow stretching across the table. The truth was, even then, there had been cracks. I just hadn't wanted to see them. I'd ignored the little things, the way her eyes sometimes wandered to her phone during our conversations, the way she'd grow quiet for no reason, the way she'd brush off my attempts to talk about the future. I'd told myself it was normal, that everyone had moments like that. But now, sitting here alone, those memories felt different. They felt like warnings I'd missed, signs I'd chosen to overlook. The waitress came over, her name tag reading Marie. She was older, probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and a tired smile. "What can I get you, Ann?" she asked, pulling out a small notepad from her apron pocket. "Just a coffee, black," I said, my voice sounding flat even to my own ears. I offered a faint smile, hoping it would make me seem less miserable than I felt. Marie nodded and disappeared behind the counter. I leaned back against the booth and stared out the window at the parking lot. The rain had slowed to a faint mist, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty asphalt. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a face I barely recognized anymore. I looked tired, older. Maybe it was just the lighting, but the lines around my eyes seemed deeper, my jaw more set. I wondered how long I'd looked like this, how long it had been since I'd felt like myself. The bell above the door jingled again, and I glanced up instinctively. A young couple walked in, laughing quietly, their arms wrapped around each other. They found a booth on the other side of the diner, their heads bent close as they whispered and smiled. For a moment, I felt a pang of jealousy and ache for something I wasn't sure I'd ever have again. They looked so carefree, so oblivious to the weight of the world. I wondered if Lily and I had ever looked like that. Maybe we had, once. Or maybe that had always been an illusion, something I'd wanted to believe because the alternative was too painful. Marie returned with my coffee, setting the steaming mug on the table in front of me. "You need anything else?" she asked, her voice gentle. I shook my head. "Thanks, I'm good." She gave me a small smile before walking away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through me. It wasn't great coffee, too watery. A little burnt, but it was something to hold on to. Something to focus on. I wrapped my hands around the mug, staring into the dark liquid as if it held some kind of answer. Of course, it didn't. Nothing did. Not the coffee, not the diner, not the memories that swirled in my head. But it was better than sitting in silence. I thought about what I'd said to Lily the night before, the words I'd thrown out in a desperate attempt to make her see how much this was hurting me. "We can't keep going on like this," I'd told her. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe she could keep going, just like she had been, detached and indifferent. It was me who couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't notice the way she looked at her phone more than she looked at me. I couldn't keep pretending that her smiles weren't meant for someone else, that her laughter wasn't sparked by messages I would never see. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't feel like a stranger in my own marriage. I took another sip of coffee, the taste a little less bitter now. The young couple was laughing again, their voices a quiet hum in the background. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were, if they understood how fragile it all was. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Either way, it didn't matter. I was here, and they were there, and the distance between us felt immeasurable. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something anger. Maybe. Not the kind of anger that makes you yell or throw things, but the quiet kind that simmers just beneath the surface. The kind that makes you want to do something, anything, to take back control. I wasn't sure what I'd do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep sitting here, waiting for things to change on their own. I had to make a choice. I had to take a step, even if I didn't know where it would lead. I finished my coffee and left a few bills on the table. As I walked out into the misty night, the cold air hit my face, sharp and bracing. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and headed to my car. The young couple's laughter followed me out, a faint echo that lingered in my ears. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, staring out at the wet, glistening pavement. I didn't know what I was going to do, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had the strength to do something. I sat in my parked car at the edge of the neighborhood park, the engine still running, the heater blowing warm air against my hands, as I clutched the steering wheel. Outside, the playground was dark and empty, the swings swaying gently in the cold wind. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a slick, wet sheen over the pavement and the metal slide. I used to come here with Lily sometimes. She'd sit on one of those swings, laughing as she pumped her legs back and forth, pretending she was a kid again. I'd push her a few times, then stand back and watch, smiling as she closed her eyes and leaned into the swing, her hair blowing in the wind. She'd always tease me about being too serious, telling me to loosen up, to enjoy the moment. And I'd try because her laughter was worth it. Seeing her happy was worth it. Or at least, it had been. Now though, the park felt like a hollow shell of those memories. The swings were just swings. The bench where we used to sit and share a coffee was just a bench. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the steering wheel, my breath fogging the cold glass. I didn't know what I was doing here. I didn't know what I was doing at all anymore. After everything that had happened, after all the silence and the distance, I was starting to feel like I didn't even recognize myself. I wasn't the kind of guy who sat around feeling sorry for himself. At least, I never thought I was. But here I was, parked at an empty playground in the middle of the night, running over the same thoughts again and again like some broken record. How did it get this far? How did we let it all slip away? I lifted my head and glanced at the passenger seat, where a crumpled grocery list sat beside an unopened bottle of water. I grabbed it before leaving the house, thinking maybe I'd still run that errand, keep myself busy. But now it just seemed like another reminder of everything that felt pointless. I hadn't even driven to the store. Instead, I'd ended up here, at this park, chasing some ghost of the past. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into my chest. Maybe I'd been holding on too tightly. Maybe I'd been fooling myself into thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just loved her enough, everything would fall back into place. But the truth was, love wasn't always enough. Sometimes, no matter how much you cared, no matter how much you gave, the other person was already gone. I thought about what Lily had said the other night, her voice so calm, so distant. Sometimes things just don't work out. I hated those words, hated how easily she'd said them, like we were just some casual thing that had run its course. But maybe she was right. Maybe things really hadn't been working for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. I'd been too stubborn, too hopeful, too afraid to let go. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you had to jump but not knowing how far down the drop was. I was scared of what would happen if I finally let go of the life I thought we had. I was scared of what would happen if I admitted that she didn't love me the way I loved her. I was scared of being alone. I leaned back in my seat, staring out at the empty park. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves on the ground, pushing them across the pavement in small, chaotic spirals. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to steady myself. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. At some point, I'd have to go home, face the quiet house, the cold bed. I'd have to figure out what came next. But right now, I just needed a few more minutes. A few more minutes to sit in this car, in this spot, and let myself feel everything I'd been trying to push away. The anger, the hurt, the emptiness. I let it all come rushing in, flooding my chest, my throat, my eyes. I let myself feel it, really feel it, because maybe that was the only way I'd be able to move forward. When I opened my eyes again, the park looked different. Not physically, it was still the same empty swings, the same dark playground, but it felt less haunted. The memories weren't gone, but they didn't sting as much. They didn't pull me down the way they had before. I still didn't know what the hell I was going to do next. I still didn't have a plan. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I thought maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need all the answers right now. Maybe I just needed to take one step at a time, even if those steps felt uncertain and shaky. I reached for the bottle of water, twisting off the cap and taking a long sip. The cold liquid grounded me, gave me something tangible to focus on. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was late, and I knew the streets would be mostly empty. I'd have a quiet drive home, some time to think, to let my mind wander. I started the car, the engine humming to life, the heater kicking back on. The warmth was a relief, a small comfort in the middle of everything else. I pulled out of the parking lot, the tires crunching over gravel, and headed down the road. The night felt endless, the sky dark and heavy, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows on the pavement. I drove slowly, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I didn't rush. There was no reason to. I passed houses with their windows glowing softly, past storefronts closed up for the night, past other cars moving like quiet ghosts through the darkness. The world felt both small and vast, like I was the only person on the road, yet somehow connected to everything around me. It was a strange feeling, but not entirely unwelcome. It was the kind of quiet that made you think, made you feel, made you remember what it meant to be alive, even when life wasn't exactly what you wanted it to be. As I neared home, I realized I wasn't as afraid of the quiet as I'd been before. I wasn't looking forward to it, exactly, but I wasn't dreading it either. It was just another part of this whole process, this whole strange, painful journey. And for the first time in a long time, I thought I might actually be okay with that. I turned down the familiar street, the house coming into view, its porch light glowing faintly in the distance. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the car, and sat there for a moment. I didn't rush to go inside. I didn't feel the need to hurry anymore. Instead, I just sat there, breathing, feeling the stillness, and letting myself be in the moment. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. I couldn't bring myself to walk through the front door right away. The porch light flickered faintly overhead, casting long shadows across the driveway. But I stayed in the car, my hand still on the steering wheel. The heater had long since stopped blowing warm air, leaving a damp chill in the small, enclosed space. I stared at the house, at the windows darkened except for the faint glow from the living room lamp, the same lamp I'd turned on before leaving. Everything about it felt lifeless. The home I'd spent years building, the place I thought would be a refuge, now felt more like a mausoleum, a silent witness to the slow death of a relationship that had once meant everything to me. The rain had finally stopped completely, leaving a quiet stillness that only seemed to amplify the heavy weight pressing on my chest. I leaned back in the seat, the cold leather sticking to my jacket, and let out a slow breath. How did we get here? I kept asking myself that, as if I didn't already know the answer. The truth was, I'd known something was wrong for a long time. I'd just been too afraid to admit it, too scared of what it would mean to really face it. Now, though, there was no escaping it. Her words still rang in my ears, as clear as if she were sitting beside me. I settled, James. That confession played on a loop in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper, stripping away the last remnants of denial I'd clung to. I thought about all the moments that had led us to this point, the nights spent in silence, the days when our conversations felt forced, the way her eyes seemed to drift past me rather than meet mine. I'd chalked it up to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship, to anything but the reality that she'd never fully chosen me in the first place. But now it was all so painfully clear. Every laugh that seemed just a little too rehearsed, every kiss that felt more like an obligation than an expression of love, every time she glanced at her phone mid-conversation, and smiled at a message I'd never see. I could see it all now, laid out before me like a map of everything I'd ignored because I didn't want to lose her. And yet, in the end, I'd lost her anyway. Or maybe I never really had her to begin with. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the trees in the front yard. I closed my eyes, letting the sound fill the empty space in my head. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly connected to her. The last time I'd looked at her and thought, this is it. This is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. I couldn't pinpoint it. I couldn't trace it back to any single moment. It had just faded over time, like a photograph left out in the sun too long, the colors bleeding together until it was hard to tell what it had once been. And now, what was left? A marriage built on a foundation that had never been solid. A love that had been more about hope than reality. It was like trying to hold on to smoke. The more I grasped at it, the more it slipped through my fingers. I opened my eyes and stared at the house again. The faint glow from the living room lamp barely reaching the edge of the driveway. It felt like a monument to failure, a reminder of all the ways I hadn't been enough for her. No matter how hard I'd tried, I'd spent years bending over backward, trying to prove my worth, trying to show her that I could be everything she needed. But I couldn't compete with a memory. I couldn't compete with the version of her ex that lived in her head, the one she held up as some unattainable ideal. I'd been chasing a finish line that kept moving further and further away, until I was left standing alone, exhausted and defeated. The sound of a car passing by on the street snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, realizing I'd been sitting here for nearly an hour. I felt the ache in my shoulders from staying so still, the stiffness in my fingers from gripping the wheel. I needed to move, needed to do something, anything, to break the paralysis that had taken hold. I reached for the door handle, the cold metal sending a small jolt through my hand. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the shadowy outline of the front door. What was I even walking into? Another night of silence? Another night pretending we could go back to the way things were? I finally pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The ground was still wet, and my shoes made a faint squishing sound as I walked up the path to the house. I slid my key into the lock, the familiar click feeling heavier than usual. As I opened the door, the warm air from inside greeted me, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt stifling. I stepped into the entryway, shutting the door behind me. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were moving through water. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the back of the chair in the hallway. The living room light cast a soft glow across the floor, but it felt dimmer than usual. The silence pressed down on me, wrapping around my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I thought about going upstairs, about saying something, anything to break the stillness. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She'd still be lying there, scrolling through her phone, her back turned to me. And I'd still be here, wondering why I wasn't enough. I walked into the living room, the lamp's light casting long shadows on the walls. I sat down on the couch, the cushions feeling unfamiliar, like I hadn't sat there in years. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands clasped together. I stared at the coffee table, at the stack of magazines that had been sitting there untouched for months, at the coaster she always insisted I use, even though it didn't matter anymore. Everything felt so normal and so wrong at the same time. I thought about reaching for the remote, turning on the TV just to fill the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt pointless. No show, no movie, no background noise could drown out the thoughts running through my head. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. I was so tired of pretending, tired of trying, tired of feeling like I was fighting a battle I'd already lost. The house felt like a cage, and no matter how much I wanted to break free, I didn't know where to go. I was stuck, trapped between the life I'd built and the realization that it was all falling apart. And I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know if I wanted to fix it anymore. I just knew that something had to change, because I couldn't keep living like this. Not anymore. I thought I'd been prepared for this moment. I really did. All those nights lying awake, rehearsing what I'd say, what I'd do if it ever came to this. The hours I'd spent staring at the ceiling, telling myself I'd be calm, composed, unshakable. And yet, when I finally stood there, looking into her eyes, all the words I'd practiced seemed to vanish into thin air. My chest felt tight, my hands clenching into fists at my sides, as I tried to steady my breathing. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Every instinct in my body told me to walk away, to turn my back and leave before things got worse. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Not until I faced her and said what needed to be said. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her phone still in her hand, as if she'd been interrupted mid-text. Her expression was guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders stiff. She looked at me with a mix of defiance and indifference, as if daring me to say what we both knew was coming. The silence between us stretched, growing thicker by the second, until I finally broke it. "You lied to me," I said, my voice low but steady. The words came out slowly, deliberately, like I was forcing them through clenched teeth. "For months, no, years you lied to me." She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she set her phone down on the coffee table, leaning back slightly as if preparing herself for a long, drawn-out conversation. "I never lied to you," she replied, her tone cool, detached. "I just didn't tell you everything." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You're really going to split hairs now? After everything?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I refused to let her see how much this was affecting me. I'd given her enough power over me already. You knew how much I trusted you, and you used that trust to hide the truth. Don't sit there and tell me you didn't lie. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. What exactly do you want from me, James? An apology? Some kind of confession? What difference would it make? You've already made up your mind. I want the truth, I snapped, louder than I intended. My voice echoed in the room, and I saw her eyes widen for just a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. I want to hear you say it. No more excuses, no more half-truths. Just tell me why. Why you stayed when you didn't love me. Why you kept pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Why you kept comparing me to him. She stared at me, her jaw tightening, her fingers gripping her arms so tightly I thought she might leave marks. For a moment, I thought she was going to lash out, to hit me with another cold, calculated remark that would leave me reeling. But instead, she just looked tired. Tired and, maybe a little sad. You want to know why? She said finally, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. Because it was easier. That's all. It was easier to stay than to leave. It was easier to pretend than to admit the truth. I thought if I stuck it out long enough, things would get better. That I'd feel differently. But I didn't. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the air rushing out of my lungs as I tried to process what she was saying. Easier. That's all it had been to her. Not love, not commitment, not loyalty. Just convenience. I felt a flash of anger, hot and blinding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Easier, the first repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. So all this time, while I was giving everything I had, while I was trying to make things work, you were just what? Waiting for it to magically fix itself. She nodded, just barely. And it was that tiny motion that finally broke something inside me. I had spent so long holding on to the hope that deep down, she still cared. That maybe, just maybe, we could salvage what was left of our marriage. But now, looking at her, I realized that hope had been a lie. I told myself, because I was too afraid to face the truth. She didn't love me, she probably never had, not in the way I loved her. And that realization hurt more than anything she could have said. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said quietly, almost to myself. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to collect my thoughts. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I thought I could fix this. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I gave it everything I had, we'd find our way back to each other. But you never wanted to come back, did you? You were already gone. She didn't answer, and that silence spoke louder than any words she could have offered. I turned back to face her, my jaw clenched, my hands trembling. You should have told me, I said, my voice breaking slightly. You should have been honest with me, from the start. Instead, you strung me along, made me believe there was still something worth fighting for. And now, here we are. She sighed, shaking her head. What do you want me to say, James? That I'm sorry? That I regret it? Fine. I'm sorry. I regret not telling you sooner. But it wouldn't have changed anything. We were never going to work, no matter how hard you tried. Those words felt like the final blow. A sharp, stinging slap that left me reeling. I stared at her, searching for anything that might make me feel differently. But all I saw was a woman who had given up a long time ago. Who had stopped caring, stopped trying, and was now just going through the motions. She was right about one thing, though. There was nothing left to fight for. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. You're right, I said, my voice hollow. We were never going to work, but not because of me. I fought for us. I believed in us. You're the one who gave up. You're the one who let us fall apart. She didn't respond, and I knew she wouldn't. She didn't have anything left to say. I turned and walked toward the door, my legs feeling heavy, my chest tight. As I reached for the doorknob, I paused, looking back over my shoulder one last time. You want to know the difference between me and him? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I loved you enough to stay. He didn't. With that, I walked out, letting the door close behind me. The night air hit me like a cold slap, but it was a relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't the kind of freedom that came with joy or relief. It was the kind of freedom that came from finally letting go of something you'd been holding on to for too long. I didn't know what was next. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do. But for now, I was free. And that was enough. I stood outside on the porch, the door shutting behind me with a soft, hollow thud. The night air was cooler than I expected, and a faint mist hung in the distance, blurring the streetlights into pale halos. My breath came out in heavy clouds, a visible reminder of the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't get her words out of my head. They echoed like a bad melody on repeat, growing sharper each time they surfaced. I settled. I settled. I settled. The phrase stung in a way I hadn't known words could. All this time, I'd thought I was building something real, something solid. All this time, I'd thought that if I loved her enough, fought hard enough, I could bring us back to what we were. But that wasn't what she wanted. That was never what she wanted. I stepped down from the porch, my boots scuffing against the concrete, and started walking toward the street. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stand still. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the houses dark, the curtains drawn. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muffled tonight. I passed by the empty park on the corner, the one where I'd once pushed her on the swings. Her laughter filling the air, as she told me I was too serious. I couldn't bring myself to look at it now. That place didn't feel like mine anymore. None of this felt like mine anymore. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets, my fingers cold despite the thick fabric. The gravel beneath my feet crunched faintly with every step, a steady rhythm that almost drowned out the sound of my thoughts. Almost. I wanted to shut it all off, turn down the volume on my anger, my confusion, my disappointment. I wanted to stop hearing her voice in my head, calm and indifferent, explaining how she'd settled for me. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how far I went, it followed me. It was everywhere. The memories too. I couldn't stop them from flooding back. I thought about the day we moved into the house, her smile as we unpacked the first boxes. She'd laughed when I tried to assemble the new bookshelf, teasing me for reading the instructions 3 times before even picking up the screwdriver. "You're too cautious," she'd said, shaking her head. "Just go for it. If it falls apart, we'll figure it out." At the time, I'd thought it was cute, her carefree attitude, her confidence that everything would work out no matter what. But now, it felt like a warning sign I'd ignored. Just go for it. If it falls apart, we'll figure it out. She wasn't just talking about the bookshelf, was she? She was talking about us. About her plan or lack of one. She didn't care if things didn't work. She just wanted something easy, something that wouldn't require effort. And I'd been foolish enough to think I was that something. I stopped walking and leaned against the street lamp at the corner, the metal cool and damp against my back. The mist was thicker here, curling around the base of the lamp post and blurring the sidewalk ahead. I stared into the haze, my mind racing. How many times had I ignored the signs? How many times had I told myself that her distance, her indifference, was just a phase? I'd let her excuses convince me. Let her half-hearted apologies smooth over the cracks in our relationship. But now I could see the truth. She'd never been all in. She'd never fully chosen me. I kicked a loose rock off the sidewalk, watching it skitter into the street. It felt good to do something physical, something small and meaningless. I wanted to punch something, to scream, to let all the frustration out. But I didn't. I just stood there, breathing deeply, trying to calm the storm inside. It wasn't working. Every time I thought I'd tamped it down, it flared back up, more intense than before. I was angry at her for pretending. Angry at myself for believing. Angry at everything that had led us to this point. But more than that, I was hurt. Hurt in a way that made my chest feel like it was caving in, that made it hard to breathe. I'd given her my heart, my trust, my life. And she'd treated it like it was second best. Like I was second best. I pushed off the lamppost and started walking again, faster this time. The rhythm of my steps was uneven, the gravel crunching erratically as my pace quickened. I needed to get away. Away from the house, away from the memories, away from the weight of it all. My hands clenched and unclenched in my pockets, the cold biting at my fingers. I wished I could feel numb, but every step seemed to bring more clarity, more painful understanding. She hadn't just settled for me, she'd settled with me. She'd let me carry the weight of the relationship, let me pour everything I had into it, while she gave the bare minimum. And I let her. I let her because I loved her. I let her because I wanted to believe that she loved me too. The street curved ahead, leading to another block of quiet houses. I stopped again, staring at the rows of windows glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. I thought about the people inside, about the couples who were probably sitting together on their couches, watching TV, talking about their day. Did they have what I had thought I had? Did they love each other the way I'd once believed Lily loved me? Or were they just going through the motions too, settling for what was easy rather than what was real? I hated that I was even asking myself these questions. I hated that I was doubting everything now, even the concept of love itself. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. I sat down on the curb, my back to the row of houses, and stared down at the cracked pavement. The mist swirled around my feet, the cold seeping into my legs as I rested my elbows on my knees. I didn't know how long I sat there, but the chill eventually started to seep into my bones. I was cold, tired, and more drained than I'd ever felt, but I still couldn't bring myself to go back home. Not yet. That house didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a building now, filled with memories I didn't want to face. I needed time to think, time to breathe, time to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. The streetlights flickered above me, their yellowish glow cutting through the mist just enough to light the sidewalk. I stared at the ground, at the cracks and weeds pushing through the concrete. They seemed so stubborn, those little plants, breaking through despite the odds. I almost envied them. Their persistence, their ability to keep growing no matter what was in their way. I wanted to feel that kind of resilience, that kind of strength. But all I felt was broken. The cracks in the sidewalk felt like the cracks in my own foundation, spreading wider with every passing moment. I didn't know if I'd ever feel whole again. I didn't know if I even knew what whole felt like anymore. As I sat there, the mist started to lift, and the streetlights seemed a little brighter. The houses didn't look as dark, and the road ahead wasn't as blurry. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and slowly got to my feet. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I did know one thing: I couldn't keep walking in circles. I couldn't keep looking back, trying to fix something that was never real. I had to move forward, even if it was just one step at a time. And so I did. I put one foot in front of the other and started walking again, not toward the past, but toward whatever lay ahead. The morning after that walk, I woke up with a strange clarity, a quiet determination that surprised even me. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting long, golden streaks across the bedroom floor, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I didn't feel an overwhelming sense of dread as I opened my eyes. Instead, I felt something else resolve. The air in the room was cold, crisp, and it carried a weight that made me take a deep breath and sit up slowly, my feet pressing against the cold wooden floorboards. I wasn't sure what I needed to do next, but I knew I couldn't keep treading water, couldn't keep drowning in the same cycle of doubt and regret. I moved through the morning routine on autopilot, a hot shower that steamed up the mirrors, the sharp scent of fresh coffee filling the kitchen, the familiar creak of the chair as I sat down at the table. But everything felt different. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was preparing. For what? Exactly, I wasn't sure, but it was there, a steady hum beneath the surface, pushing me forward. I pulled my laptop from the desk, opened it, and started typing. It wasn't a long-winded message or a grand declaration. Just a simple email to my lawyer, asking how to start the process. I sat back in my chair after hitting send, staring out the window at the quiet street beyond. The neighbors were starting their day, dog walkers, joggers, the mail carrier making his rounds. The world was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. By the afternoon, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but less suffocating. I cleaned up the kitchen, throwing out old takeout boxes, and wiping down the counters. I opened the windows and let the cool breeze filter through, airing out the space that had grown stale from weeks of neglect. The clutter, the mess, it all seemed to mirror the chaos in my mind, and clearing it out felt like clearing out the remnants of something that no longer belonged. I took down the photos on the mantle, the ones that had once seemed so perfect, so full of promise. They felt like lies now, and I couldn't bear to look at them. I packed them away in a box, and shoved it into the back of the closet, out of sight. I wasn't erasing the past. I was just giving myself room to breathe. As the day went on, I found myself pacing the living room, my thoughts spinning faster than I could keep up with. Every step I took seemed to unearth another memory, another moment I'd been holding on to. There were the good times, of course, laughter on the beach, quiet nights with a movie and a bottle of wine. But those moments were always accompanied by a shadow, a subtle tension that I'd ignored for too long. The glances at her phone during dinner, the way she'd deflect when I tried to talk about the future, the subtle shift in her tone whenever I brought up something that mattered to me. I'd told myself it was normal, that every couple had their ups and downs, but now I could see it for what it was. The foundation had never been as solid as I'd believed. It had always been cracked, always on the verge of collapse. I stopped in front of the mirror by the front door, catching my reflection out of the corner of my eye. I looked tired, older than I remembered. There were lines on my face I hadn't noticed before, shadows under my eyes that didn't seem to fade. But there was something else, too. A set to my jaw, a steadiness in my gaze. I wasn't broken, not completely. I was still standing, still breathing, still here. The person staring back at me wasn't the man I'd been yesterday or the week before. He was someone different, someone who had faced the truth and survived it. I looked at myself for a long moment, then turned away. I didn't need the mirror to tell me who I was. I already knew. As the evening set in, I sat down on the couch with a pen and a notebook. I hadn't done that in years, actually written things down by hand. But it felt right. I let the words flow without judgment, without second guessing. Thoughts, fears, hopes, everything that had been swirling in my head for so long poured out onto the page. I wrote about the moment I realized she didn't love me, the moment I knew I had to leave, and the moment I finally accepted that leaving was the right choice. I wrote about what I wanted for myself, what I needed to heal, what I hoped the future would hold. The words came faster and faster, until my hand cramped and the ink smudged against the edge of the page. I didn't stop. I couldn't. This was my truth, my story, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was writing it for myself, not for anyone else. By the time I set the notebook down, the room was bathed in the soft glow of the floor lamp. The street outside was quiet again, the neighbors' houses dark, the sidewalks empty. I stretched out on the couch, my head resting against the cushion, and stared up at the ceiling. There was still so much I didn't know, so many questions I didn't have answers to. But one thing was clear, I was no longer waiting for her to define my happiness. I was no longer clinging to a life that wasn't mine. I was finally free to choose my own path, to walk away from the shadows and step into something new. It wasn't easy, it never would be. The pain wasn't gone, it still lingered, still pressed against my chest at times. But it didn't own me anymore. It didn't define me. Every breath I took felt a little lighter, every step a little firmer. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. It excited me. It gave me hope. And that, I realized, was enough. Wow. I never thought my life would take such a dramatic turn. But here I am, stronger and wiser. Do you think I made the right decision? What would you have done in my shoes? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with your friends. In my experience, holding on to something that doesn't serve you, be it a relationship, a job, or even an old mindset, only drags you down. Walking away can be painful, but sometimes it's the healthiest choice you'll ever make. It's not about giving up, it's about choosing yourself, your peace, and your well-being. Life's too short to settle for less than you deserve. If you find yourself stuck in a toxic situation, remember, it's okay to let go, to step into the unknown, and to build something better. Your future self will thank you for it.